Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Federman. I'm a designer, developer, prototyper, whatever, depends on the day. I work on the design system at Adobe. We call it Spectrum. And I was told last night by this guy named Ian, hi Ian, if you're here, that I should open with a terrible joke. So here it is. How does the man on the moon cut his hair? He clips it. So let's talk about design systems. And what is this thing you speak of, Sarah? Well, design systems is a tool that's primarily used by designers and developers, sometimes PMs, sometimes content strategists. It helps create a consistent user experience across your product. Consistent interactions in UI means a better UX, which means you make more money, which is good. So something like you may have seen the Lightning design system. That's a great example of an existing system out there. Okay, but what is it actually? It might be a library of components, usually their implementations of the code. It might be Sketch, AI, XD, Figma, et cetera, documents, code repositories. It could be a React code, Angular code, Ember code, just HTML, CSS, vanilla JavaScript code, and a documentation site, which is what a lot of people think of when they think of the design system. They think of the style guide. So who makes them? It depends on your company. So a lot of times at a bigger company, it might be a full-time team working on this. It might be one or two people working on it full-time, or it might be a federation, kind of a democracy, leadership group, whatnot. It might live in your design org. It might be an infrastructure team on the engineering side. It really depends on your needs, so we'll get into more of that later. But on the other hand, it's probably a bunch of people with multidisciplinary skill sets. So that means designers who understand engineering. They're probably thinking in components more often. They abstract content from layout easily, and they're more aware of and design for edge cases. I know a lot of us have gotten a bunch of mocks from designers with magic numbers. That happens less often when designers are actually working on the components themselves. And engineers that understand design know how to use the stuff that they're given right off the bat, so less spec work. They can get things rolling quickly. They ask more questions about UX, so things that the designer may not have documented or may not have actually thought about. Those are things that developers are always asking about. These are people that can extract layout information. They probably shouldn't have to, so it actually costs more usually for designers to go into Sketch and AI and get all those values out than actually delivering that stuff. So just side note. And accessibility experts are key. So if your components and your drop-downs and your buttons and your whatnot aren't accessible, then at the design system level, they're not going to be accessible anywhere. So this is super key. Have people that care about accessibility and have people that know how to implement it. But really, it comes down to empathy. The users of your design system have super diverse needs, and it's up to your team to make sure that you're actually building the right thing. So why do I want one? Well, a design system means I get quicker iteration on products. So we can go into our sketch files and just grab a bunch of things and start making a page out of those. And that means we have an app in about 15 minutes. And designers can focus on the things that are actually really important, like your user flow, your feature set, all the things that really make or break the user experience for your application. It creates stronger brand awareness. So Facebook has a button. You know what a Facebook button looks like. You know what a Facebook website looks like. That's because they have a strong design system. And everybody speaks the same language. So the designers know what they're talking about when they're talking about a subtitle. The developers know that the designers are talking about the subtitle. And all of those things kind of come together when you're working on a great workflow. And it empowers your developers. So if you're blocked by design, you probably don't have a super complex and comprehensive design system yet. So if a mock comes in from a designer, you can just go in and you can say, hey, I see that you're using blue number 3 here, and I have that in my code base, so let's just make this happen. You don't have to ask as many questions. You might have a tab that doesn't have all the different views in your mocks, and so if you have usage guidelines that tell you the tab view should look like this in this state, you can build that. And of course, you make more money if you have better UX, so, you know. A couple of the risks that might come up with making a design system, if you're not meeting everybody's needs, which happens, it's a hard problem, you might have a lower adoption rate. And keeping your comps and your code up to date is really hard. A lot of smart people are working on this problem. I'll leave it to them to talk about. And messy implementations make people hate your design system, so don't do that. Use craftsmanship. It's a little bit of a single point of failure. So if at one point your drop-down stops working, probably all the drop-downs stop working, which is not a great place to be, so use testing. And one-off solutions are a thing, so if you're not meeting the needs of your designers and you're not meeting the needs of the applications, you might have a couple things that have a little bit of a tweak, but instead of tweaking the design system, which is sometimes a harder thing, they might go ahead and they might make their own, which, again, then you have to integrate it later down the line or risk it becoming out of date. So I want to talk a little bit about the different types of design systems and what they're composed of and how people work with them. The first thing that's usually on everybody's mind when they start thinking about, are we going to create a design system? What's going to happen with this design system is, what's our design system? Is it going to be built for the web? Is it going to be built for native? What's our tech stack? What goes into this? And depending on the company and depending on your needs, we have things that aren't tied to certain tech stacks, so things like your UI sticker sheets that designers use to compose their mockups and design tokens, which are essentially variables that design controls. So things like subtitle 2, padding 1, all these little variables, those tools are all of your things consume these values and automatically get a lot of consistency just for free. At Adobe, we actually start with JSON. We have a tool that creates Sass variables, CSS vars, or native or mobile values, depending on your situation. And if we change a value down the line, those changes are propagated to all the application consuming our tokens. And then you might have an HTML, CSS implementation. So if you do this, you're not actually delivering Angular code or React code or Vue code. You're just delivering the HTML and CSS, and you're leaving it up to the developers to translate that. It might work great if you have server-side applications. It might not. So the advantages of staying a little bit more framework agnostic is you're not maintaining a full solution. It can be used with any framework, and it shares resources across implementations. The risks are that it's actually harder for teams to adopt it because they have to do some sort of their own interpretation. It's harder to be a little bit comprehensive, and it's easy to kind of like sit back and stay abstract because you're not actually implementing all these things. You have to be a really good communicator and make sure that you're actually hitting all of your users' needs. And I mean, not a lot of people are doing that, so it's kind of hard to figure it out yourself. If you're going the framework integrated route, or both, you get something that's easily integrated into all your products. It's kind of a drop-in solution, and you get full control over the implementation. So if something is wrong, it's your fault. If it's right, it's good job. And then the risks are it's tightly coupled with your tech stack. So it's probably going to be rewritten when next new magical JavaScript framework comes out. At Adobe, we actually have a ton of frameworks. So our team, the design system team, maintains a spec, and that's our design system. And then we work with certain teams that maintain their own implementations of the spec. So those are the framework integrated teams, and we're over here on the design or framework agnostic side, telling them what this should look like and how it should behave, and then helping them out with that. On the content side, there's a ton of stuff that can go into this. And it's kind of how you judge how mature a design system is by seeing what actually goes into it. So things like buttons, links, documentation. At the middle level, you kind of get into more complex components, code style guidelines, developer tooling, and of course design tokens, your variables. And then if you're going really comprehensive, which is high-level guidelines, so how do we use tabs? What's the best way to use a drop-down? What's a button supposed to be used for, et cetera, et cetera. Accessibility is super key. You might have internationalization guidelines. Motion is a big one. That's kind of a key indicator that you're at that mature state. Voice and tone, that's another one. And workflow tooling, and that's kind of where we're not really there yet. At Adobe, we are working on this, and keep your eyes open, but some other companies are doing some really cool things. So you may have seen React Sketch from Airbnb. You may have seen some Salesforce Chrome extension. They have some really cool stuff going on there. But this is a huge space to work in, so if you guys have ideas, let's make it happen. And how do I decide on an approach? So what are your resources? Who do you have that can work on this? What are you using currently? Do you have one designer that grabbed a bunch of things that they just kind of put on a style sheet and they're making that work? Can you use that already? And then tailor it to your org. So if your org has a ton of devs and just a couple designers, you have to be very specific with your guidelines, because they're not always going to be able to ask a designer, how do I do this? What should this look like in this state? What happens here? If your org is really design heavy, you might want to focus on some more tooling for designers. And of course, what can you afford? What are your budget constraints? And do you have a large suite of products that really need a complex system? Or would that be overkill for you? A lot of people don't really need all of this stuff, and you should be the best judge of that. If you can't afford to have your own team, then don't. So I put together this really simple graphic, basically just outlining what other companies are doing, a couple examples. You'll note that the ones that are really more agnostic are the companies with a lot of different products. So they're trying to come up with ways that are really just work with all of their products without having to do the work 10 times over. So that's something that a lot of companies are trying to innovate on. Google's doing a lot of cool tooling work right now about this stuff. And a side note on terminology, the first time I gave this talk, I got the feedback that I kind of should have gone over the difference between a style guide and a design system, et cetera, et cetera. This was a conscious decision that I made because I personally don't find much utility in separating these concepts, but I kind of want to clarify this. When we start talking about design systems versus pattern libraries versus style guides, it kind of ends with graphs like this, and this, and this, and honestly, none of it matters, because as long as your team knows what you're talking about, you're good. You may have noticed these charts use a lot of words that probably could be synonyms, but they are a little bit different. And if you start trying to explain one, you're probably going to use the other words in the definition, and then we're all confused. So let's not do that. Defining things is kind of like a fun exercise, and it makes you more comfortable. But after a certain point, it's not all that useful. So do it once at the beginning, choose something flexible, and go with it. Because really the point is design systems are constantly evolving. So embrace it. This is just like a totally, this was a software quote that Sarah did, but I thought it was really prudent and applied to design systems. So if you're over-categorizing or spending a bunch of time ironing out definitions, it's not going to help. My only bias here is just err on the side of what developers understand, because, I mean, developers have enough problems with naming things already. So if you can align with their mental model where you can, it's going to make things smoother. And this is kind of one quote that's, again, about something completely different, but it's really been driving my thoughts about design systems and how it was never really, this was never really about design systems in the first place, but it fits perfect. Everything that your design system consists of should be documented. So why not just treat the documentation as a source of truth? Simplify things. If it isn't documented, it's not existing. It doesn't exist. And it doesn't just have to be documented, it has to be taught and explained, and people will be excited about your product. And not just excited about your design system, but excited about what your design system is used to build. So, thank you, everyone. I have some more resources here, and we don't have time for questions, but see me afterwards.